There is a version of World War I that most people have absorbed without ever reading a single history book. It lives in the black and white photographs, in the poppies, in the careful language of memorials that call it a sacrifice and leave the sentence unfinished. It is a version that has been so thoroughly processed, so gently packaged for public consumption, that the actual experience of the war, the physical reality, the institutional machinery, the quiet administrative decisions that sent men to die in increments, has been almost completely replaced by a kind of national mythology that serves the living far more than it ever honored the dead. This script is not interested in that version. What follows is an accounting of what the war actually produced, not what it meant, not what it stood for, not the lessons it supposedly taught. What it produced, mechanically, biologically, psychologically, and institutionally, when you place millions of human beings inside an industrial killing system and run that system continuously for over 4 years. The realities covered here were not secrets in the sense that they were unknown. They were secrets in the sense that they were systematically managed, minimized, reclassified, and in many cases simply absorbed into the routine bureaucratic language of military administration until they stopped registering as outrages and started registering as logistics problems. That transformation, from horror to paperwork, is perhaps the most disturbing thing the war produced, and it did not end when the guns went silent. The war began in the summer of 1914 with an almost universal expectation that it would be short. Not short in the way that optimists hope things will be short, but short in a more confident technical sense. Military planners on both sides had built their strategies around the assumption that modern industrial armies meeting in open field maneuver would produce a decisive result within weeks. The German Schlieffen Plan, which had been refined for years, assumed that France could be knocked out of the war before Russian mobilization could become a serious factor. The French had their own offensive doctrine, Plan 16, built on the idea that aggressive assault and élan, the untranslatable French word for fighting spirit, would carry the day against any opponent. The British Expeditionary Force, small but professional, assumed that its superior training and marksmanship would make the difference in whatever engagement it was thrown into. All of these assumptions were wrong, not slightly wrong. Not wrong in ways that could be corrected by minor adjustments. They were catastrophically, structurally wrong in ways that the men who held them could not bring themselves to fully acknowledge until tens of thousands of their soldiers were already dead, and even then the acknowledgement came slowly, partially, and was never quite complete. The first reality that soldiers were forced to accept was this. The rifle and the machine gun had made offensive movement across open ground into a form of organized suicide, and the men in charge knew it, and they ordered the attacks anyway. The mathematics of this were not complicated. A single Maxim gun, properly positioned, could fire between 400 and 600 rounds per minute. It required a crew of 2 to 4 men to operate. It could cover a wide arc of fire across open ground. An attacking infantry unit, advancing in extended line at a walking pace, which was the standard assault formation in the early war, because running men lost cohesion and arrived at the objective too disordered to fight, was presenting a continuous stream of human bodies moving toward that gun at a rate of perhaps 100 yards per minute across broken ground. The gun could fire many times faster than men could move. The math produced predictable results, and it produced them immediately in the first major engagements of the war in August and September of 1914, when the casualties on both sides were so severe that the numbers were quietly suppressed from public reporting for weeks. France lost approximately 27,000 men killed in a single day on August 22, 1914, a figure that would not be officially acknowledged in full for decades. The Battle of the Frontiers, the collective name for the early Franco-German engagements, cost the French army approximately 300,000 casualties in the first month of fighting. The British Expeditionary Force, which had arrived in France with roughly 80,000 men, was functionally destroyed at Mons and Le Cateau and the Marne before the year was out. and was replaced by a new army composed of volunteers who were being trained while their predecessors died. And yet the attacks continued. They continued not because the commanders were stupid, though some were. They continued not because the commanders were indifferent to the deaths, though some were that too. They continued primarily because there was no other option that fell within the operational logic that these armies had been built to execute, and because stopping the attacks meant accepting a strategic situation that no government, no general staff, and no king was politically prepared to accept. The war was too large, too expensive, too deeply embedded in national survival narratives on every side to be simply paused while someone invented a new way to fight it. So the attacks continued. And the second reality that soldiers were forced to accept was the trench itself. The trench system that came to define the Western Front was not designed. It was not the product of deliberate military engineering applied to a stable tactical situation. It was the sedimentation of exhaustion. Both sides, having failed to achieve decisive breakthrough in the fall of 1914, had dug in to consolidate their gains and protect their men from the fire that was killing them in the open. Each side then extended its line to prevent the other from flanking it, and each extension was met with another extension, until by the late fall of 1914, the front ran from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border, over 400 miles, and neither side could move it by more than a few miles in either direction for the next 4 years. The trench was a solution to the problem of surviving under fire, and it was a genuinely effective solution for that specific problem. Men in trenches were much harder to kill with direct fire than men in the open. The problem was that the trench was also a cage. Once you were in it, you were trapped in a landscape that had been specifically optimized to kill you if you tried to leave it. The ground in front of your position had been cleared of cover, seeded with barbed wire entanglements, registered by enemy artillery, and covered by interlocking machine gun fire from positions you could not see. Leaving the trench in daylight was, in most sectors, functionally equivalent to a death sentence. Leaving it at night was only marginally safer. The trench itself was not comfortable. The popular image of the Western Front trench, deep, carefully revetted with duckboards and communication channels and relatively dry conditions, describes the ideal, not the reality for the vast majority of men who inhabited these positions. In many sectors, particularly in Flanders and along the Somme, the geology of the ground made deep trenching nearly impossible. The water table in parts of Flanders sat just 2 or 3 feet below the surface. Digging down meant digging into water. The solution was to build up rather than down, constructing parapets and breastworks from sandbags above the existing ground level, which provided less protection and degraded faster under shell fire. The mud of the Ypres salient and the Passchendaele battlefield has become almost mythological, but the mythology does not exaggerate it. This was not ordinary mud. It was a saturated mixture of churned soil, decomposing organic matter, rainwater, and the physical remains of years of continuous bombardment and burial and exhumation that turned the battlefield into a semi-liquid surface that could and did swallow men whole. Horses drowned in shell craters on the Passchendaele battlefield. Men who slipped off the duckboard paths in the dark could disappear into the ground before anyone could reach them. The medical records from this sector contain a category of casualty that appears in no heroic narrative of the war. Men who were listed as missing but were known to have sunk into the ground and been consumed by it. The third reality soldiers were forced to accept was the smell. This sounds like a minor thing compared to the physical dangers of trench warfare, but men who survived the war returned to it again and again in their memoirs and letters and interviews, often more than they returned to specific battles or wounds. The smell of the Western Front was a composite of specific components that once encountered apparently could not be forgotten. There was the smell of the unburied dead. There was the smell of the latrines, which in many sectors were simple trenches dug perpendicular to the main line, open to the air, used by hundreds of men, and impossible to properly maintain in the conditions of active combat. There was the smell of the gas. the chlorine and phosgene that clung to low ground and accumulated in dugouts, and later the mustard gas that soaked into clothing and equipment and soil and lingered for days after an attack. There was the smell of wet wool and wet leather, and the specific bacterial smell of skin that has been wet and not properly dried for weeks. There was the smell of the food, issued cold from field kitchens that were often too far behind the line to deliver hot rations and contaminated by the general conditions of the environment it passed through to reach the men. Veterans' accounts describe the smell hitting them before they even reached the front line on their first tour. Men who were rotated back from rest billets described being able to smell the front from miles away as they moved back into the line. Some accounts describe men vomiting during their first exposure. Most accounts describe a relatively rapid acclimatization, not because the smell diminished, but because the human olfactory system habituates to sustained stimuli, a fact of biology that the military found convenient and never particularly examined. The fourth reality was the rats. The rat population of the Western Front was not incidental to the conditions of trench warfare. It was a direct product of those conditions, and it grew to a scale that contemporary accounts struggled to convey to civilians without being dismissed as exaggeration. The trenches provided rats with everything they required: shelter in the form of the excavated earthworks and the spaces beneath duckboards and behind revetting material, water in the form of the standing pools that accumulated everywhere, and food in the form of the rations that could not be perfectly secured in field conditions, and, more significantly, in the form of the human and animal dead that were present in enormous quantities in the ground and on the surface of the front zone. Rats on the Western Front grew to unusually large sizes. Contemporary accounts mention rats the size of small cats. Modern analysis of this phenomenon suggests that the combination of abundant food and shelter, combined with the removal of most natural predators from the front zone, produced conditions for rapid population growth and, over the span of years, some degree of size increase among the dominant individuals in the population. These were not domesticated animals showing affection or curiosity. They were wild animals that had adapted to living in close proximity to humans and had lost most of their instinctive fear of human presence. They moved through the trenches at night in large numbers. They ran across sleeping men. They gnawed at equipment, at food stores, at leather, and at the dead. Men who attempted to trap or kill them found that the population could not be meaningfully reduced. The rats were part of the trench system in the same way the mud and the wire were part of it, a fixed feature of the environment that had to be endured, not solved. The fifth reality was the lice. Every man on the Western Front had lice. This was not a matter of personal hygiene or individual failure. It was a structural certainty of the conditions. Lice are transmitted through direct contact and through shared clothing and equipment, and in the conditions of trench warfare, where men lived in close physical proximity for extended periods, shared blankets and dugout space, and had extremely limited access to bathing facilities or clean clothing, transmission was universal and reinfestation was continuous. A man could be deloused at a rest billet. The standard method involved immersing clothing in steam chambers that killed the adult insects, and return to the line and be infested again within days. The effect of continuous louse infestation on the human body was not merely itching, though the itching was severe and contributed significantly to sleep deprivation. Body lice are vectors for trench fever, a bacterial infection caused by Bartonella quintana that was first identified as a distinct clinical entity on the Western Front in 1915, and that by the end of the war had infected an estimated 500,000 Allied soldiers. Trench fever produced high fever, severe leg pain, headache, and a relapsing pattern that could keep men incapacitated for weeks. It was rarely fatal, but was enormously debilitating and contributed substantially to the constant attrition of manpower that the armies had to manage as a continuous administrative problem. The medical establishment was slow to identify trench fever as a distinct disease because its symptoms overlapped with several other conditions common in the trenches: And because the institutional pressure to return men to the line as quickly as possible discouraged extended diagnostic investigation of non-fatal illnesses. The connection between body lice and the disease was not conclusively established until 1918, 4 years into the war, by which point several 100,000 men had already cycled through the illness, and the military medical bureaucracy had developed a system for managing it that prioritized throughput over treatment. The sixth reality was what the war did to the concept of time. The trench system created a temporal experience unlike anything in ordinary civilian life, and unlike anything that military training had prepared men for. The front was not always violent. In many sectors, for extended periods, there was a kind of malevolent quiet, in which nothing dramatically bad was happening. But the constant possibility of something dramatically bad happening could not be escaped. Men lived in this condition for days and weeks, and in some cases months, and the sustained alertness it required, the inability to fully relax, the constant peripheral monitoring of the environment for the sounds and signs that preceded attack or bombardment, produced a form of chronic exhaustion that was different from physical tiredness, and that rest alone could not repair. There was no genuine privacy in the trenches. There was no genuine silence. There was no genuine darkness at night, because the front was continuously illuminated by flares and occasionally by the distant flash of artillery. There was no reliable schedule, because military operations happened when they happened and required immediate response, regardless of what the men were doing or how long they had been awake. The rhythm of daily life, the civilian markers of morning, afternoon, evening, night, work, rest, social time, private time, was completely disrupted by the condition of being in the line, and the disruption was sustained for weeks at a stretch before rotation brought men back to rest billets where the rhythms of ordinary life were only partially recoverable. Men who wrote about this aspect of the experience struggled to convey it precisely because it operated below the level of specific incident. It was not a wound. It was not a battle. It was the accumulated effect of sustained abnormal existence on the human nervous system, and its results were only visible in the long term, in the changed behavior, the sleep disturbance, the startling at sounds, the difficulty concentrating, the emotional blunting that veterans brought home with them and that the post-war medical establishment largely failed to recognize as war-related pathology. The seventh reality was artillery. Artillery was not the most emotionally resonant weapon of World War I. That distinction probably belongs to the gas or to the machine gun, with its implication of industrial mass processing. But artillery was, by the statistics, the primary killing instrument of the war. Approximately 60% of all casualties on the Western Front, wounded and killed, were produced by artillery fire. This figure is so large that it requires some dwelling upon. Artillery killed at range. It killed from positions that were invisible to the men it was killing. It killed without discrimination between units, ranks, or individual merit. It killed men who were in their dugouts asleep. It killed men who were eating. It killed men who had just arrived in the line for their first tour, and men who had survived 3 years of the war without significant injury. It killed in ways that did not always resemble what civilians imagined killing to look like. A direct hit from a heavy shell on a dugout or a section of trench did not necessarily leave bodies. It left organic material. It left the contents of what had been men distributed across the surface of the ground in a pattern that was determined by the physics of the explosion and not by anything else. Recovery parties sent out after such events often could not reconstruct the number of dead from what they found, and the administrative solution to this problem, the missing, the no-known grave, the name on a memorial wall, was a paperwork category that served military record-keeping requirements without addressing what had actually happened to the men. The experience of surviving an artillery bombardment was one of the defining psychological experiences of the Western Front, and it was qualitatively different from being under any other form of fire. Rifle and machine gun fire could be returned, evaded, or at least tracked to a source. Artillery fire, particularly heavy artillery fire from positions miles behind the enemy line, arrived without warning, could not be seen coming, could not be anticipated by anything the men under it could observe, and could not be responded to in any direct way. The correct response to an artillery bombardment was to get into cover and stay there, which meant accepting complete passivity in the face of something that was trying to kill you, and waiting for it to stop, and not knowing when it would stop. Men who survived prolonged bombardments described a progressive deterioration of cognitive function during the experience. Thinking became difficult, memory became unreliable, basic task performance degraded. Some men became completely unresponsive, sitting or lying in their dugouts in a state that appeared to be cataleptic, unresponsive to voice or touch, neither fighting nor fleeing, but simply absent from their own experience in some functional sense. Others became hysterical, screaming or weeping uncontrollably, and had to be physically restrained by their comrades to prevent them from leaving cover. Others remained apparently functional, but exhibited behavioral changes in the days following a heavy bombardment. Increased irritability, difficulty sleeping, exaggerated startle responses that represented the early symptoms of what we would now recognize as acute stress reaction. The eighth reality was shell shock, and the institution's response to it. The clinical entity that came to be called shell shock, later renamed and re-renamed in successive editions of psychiatric classification manuals, and now understood as a manifestation of what we would call post-traumatic stress, emerged as a recognized phenomenon on the Western Front within the first year of the war. It emerged not because military medicine was attentive to psychological suffering, but because the symptoms were so severe and so widespread that they could not be administratively ignored. Men were arriving at casualty clearing stations in states of complete neurological collapse, unable to walk, unable to speak, trembling continuously, blind without any ophthalmological explanation, deaf without any otological explanation, paralyzed without any spinal injury. They presented with conversion disorders, with dissociative states, with what appeared to be profound neurological damage, but for which no physical mechanism could be identified. The initial military response was to frame this as either physical injury, the concussive effects of shell explosions on the nervous system, which gave the condition its name, or as malingering, deliberate simulation of illness to avoid duty. Both framings were convenient because neither required the institution to acknowledge that the war itself was psychologically destroying the men it was using to fight it. The shell concussion explanation allowed the condition to be classified as a wound, which implied eventual recovery and return to duty. The malingering explanation allowed it to be classified as a disciplinary problem, which implied punishment and coercion as appropriate responses. The treatment protocols that developed from these framings varied enormously across the armies and evolved over the course of the war, but they shared a common institutional priority: getting men back to the line as quickly as possible. The forward psychiatry model developed by British military medicine in the latter years of the war, treating men close to the front, emphasizing brief rest and the expectation of return to duty rather than evacuation to rear hospitals, was genuinely more effective at achieving recovery for some patients, but the institutional motivation for developing it was not primarily therapeutic. It was manpower management. Men who were evacuated to base hospitals and then to hospitals in England with shell-shock diagnoses had a significantly lower rate of return to duty than men treated forward. The institutional response to this finding was not to ask why the war was destroying men's minds, but to develop systems that interrupted the evacuation pathway before it could be completed. Treatment near the front, with the sounds of the artillery audible and the expectation of return to combat explicit in every interaction between patient and clinician, produced different outcomes than treatment in a quiet hospital far from the front, and the military found this useful. Men who refused to return to duty after treatment, or who were judged to be simulating their symptoms, were court-martialed. The British Army executed 306 men during World War I for offences including desertion, cowardice, and quitting a post. A significant number of these men almost certainly had what would now be recognized as severe untreated psychological trauma. The medical evidence for this was available at the time. Psychiatric witnesses testified on behalf of some of these men at their courts-martial, but the institutional need for deterrence outweighed the clinical evidence in most cases, and the executions were carried out. The ninth reality was gas. Poison gas was introduced to the Western Front in April 1915, when German forces released approximately 168 tons of chlorine from cylinders along a 4-mile front at the Second Battle of Ypres, creating a yellow-green cloud that drifted toward the Allied lines in the afternoon wind. The French colonial troops in the path of the cloud had no protection, no warning, and no training for what they were experiencing. A large portion of them fled. The German forces, who had not been completely certain the attack would work, were not fully prepared to exploit the breach in the line that the gas created, and the opportunity for significant breakthrough was lost. But the weapon had demonstrated its potential, and both sides developed it rapidly. The chemistry of the war's gas weapons evolved through several generations over the following 3 years. Chlorine was detectable. You could smell it. It was visible in sufficient concentration, and the improvised initial countermeasures of wet cloth over the face, though inadequate, provided some partial protection. Phosgene, introduced later, was less detectable, caused delayed symptoms that appeared up to 48 hours after exposure when the victim might have already been returned to duty, and was responsible for approximately 80% of gas deaths during the war. Mustard gas, introduced by Germany in 1917, was not primarily a killing agent. It was a debilitating agent designed to produce casualties that required extended medical care, to contaminate terrain and equipment, and to produce psychological effects through the fear of exposure. Mustard gas attacked exposed skin, the mucous membranes of the eyes and respiratory tract, and the lungs. It caused large blisters wherever it contacted skin, including internally in the lungs and throat if inhaled. It could cause temporary or permanent blindness. It could cause chemical burns to the genitals and armpits, areas that soldiers found deeply difficult to discuss and that therefore received inadequate treatment attention. It had a delayed onset of several hours, meaning men could be contaminated without knowing it, return to enclosed spaces like dugouts where they contaminated others, and only begin to show symptoms when the damage was already done. The British military hospital records for the last year of the war contain large volumes of mustard gas casualties, and the clinical descriptions in these records, which were generally written in the controlled language of medical observation, document injuries of considerable severity and suffering. The institutional response to mustard gas casualties was shaped by the fact that the vast majority of them were not immediately life-threatening. Men who had been gassed with mustard were in severe pain, often temporarily blinded, often unable to move without assistance, but most of them would eventually survive. This meant that in the triage systems used at casualty clearing stations, where the most serious wounds received priority treatment, mustard gas casualties were frequently placed in waiting areas and given minimal immediate care, while men with more immediately life-threatening injuries were treated first. The men in these waiting areas were conscious, in severe pain, and in many cases unable to see, which produced conditions that medical staff found among the most distressing of their wartime experience. The 10th reality was the experience of the infantry soldier in an attack. The tactical problem facing attacking infantry on the Western Front remained essentially constant throughout the war. Despite the enormous changes in artillery, logistics, and military technology that occurred between 1914 and 1918, the problem was this: to move a large number of men from their own trench to the enemy trench several hundred yards away, across ground that had been systematically prepared to prevent exactly this movement, while under fire from weapons that were specifically designed and positioned to kill men attempting exactly this movement. The preparation for a major attack followed a generally consistent pattern. Artillery would bombard the enemy position for a period ranging from days to weeks, with the stated objective of destroying the enemy wire, killing or neutralizing the defenders, and destroying the machine gun positions that would engage the attacking infantry. This preparation was visible, audible, and completely non-secret to the defenders, who had often constructed multiple defensive lines specifically to survive the bombardment and man their weapons when it ended. The attacking infantry would assemble in their trenches before dawn, typically after a night of movement and assembly that precluded sleep, and would go over the top at a designated 0 hour, usually just after dawn. What happened in the seconds and minutes after 0 hour was the central experience of the Western Front, and it has been described thousands of times in memoirs and letters and interviews, and it has not been fully conveyed in any of them. The noise was described as beyond comprehension. The simultaneous sound of friendly artillery firing overhead, enemy artillery responding, machine guns opening up across the front, rifle fire from thousands of weapons, the sound of shells detonating, the sound of men being hit. The visual environment was described as chaotic in the extreme. Smoke from the artillery, smoke from grenades and trench mortar fire, the dust and debris thrown up by explosions, the wire obstacles that divided the ground into irregular compartments, the shell craters from previous bombardments that had turned the entire surface into broken, uneven terrain that slowed movement to a fraction of its normal pace. Men who survived attacks described moving in a kind of narrowed perceptual state in which normal cognition was not operating. They moved forward because they were supposed to move forward, because their training had made forward movement in this context automatic, because the men around them were moving forward, because stopping meant getting shot or waiting to be ordered to move again. They were aware of men falling around them without necessarily registering it as a significant event in the moment. They were aware of reaching the enemy wire and finding it uncut, of finding shell craters that forced the attacking line to bunch up and thereby become more concentrated targets, of finding the enemy machine guns that the artillery had been supposed to destroy still operational and still firing. The British attack on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916, produced 57,470 British casualties, of whom 19,240 were killed. This remains the single worst day in the history of the British Army. The attack had been prepared by a week-long artillery bombardment that fired approximately 1.7 million shells at the German positions. A significant portion of these shells were duds that did not explode. A significant portion of the shells that did explode were shrapnel rounds designed for use against men in the open rather than high explosive rounds capable of destroying deep dugouts. The German defenders in many sectors had sheltered in their deep dugouts during the bombardment and emerged, largely intact, when the British barrage lifted and the infantry attacked. The men who led those attacks knew, or should have known, that the artillery preparation had not achieved what it was supposed to achieve. Aerial observation had reported intact wire in multiple sectors. Intelligence had indicated the depth and quality of the German dugout construction. Some senior commanders had raised concerns before the attack. The attack proceeded anyway, at the time and on the frontage that had been planned, because the operational logic of the campaign, the need to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun, the need to demonstrate to the Allied coalition that the British were carrying their share of the burden, the need to use the volunteer army that had been raised and trained over the previous 18 months before it was used up by the ordinary attrition of holding the line, outweighed the evidence that the attack could not achieve its objectives at the cost the planning assumed. The 11th reality was the medical system. The military medical system of the First World War was, by the standards of its time, a genuine achievement of organizational logistics. The sheer volume of casualties that the Western Front produced required a medical infrastructure of a scale and complexity that had no precedent in military history, and the armies built this infrastructure largely from scratch in the early months of the war, developing the triage and evacuation systems that still form the basis of military medicine today. The mortality rate for wounded soldiers who reached a surgical facility alive was significantly lower in World War I than in previous major wars, as a result of improvements in surgical technique, anesthesia, blood transfusion, and the organizational efficiency of the evacuation chain. This is the version of First World War medicine that appears in institutional histories. It is accurate as far as it goes. What it does not convey is the experience of being processed by this system. A wounded man on the Western Front entered the medical system at the regimental aid post, typically located in a dugout or a ruined building as close to the front as shelter allowed, staffed by a regimental medical officer and a handful of stretcher bearers. The regimental medical officer's primary function was not complex surgical intervention, which the conditions did not permit. It was assessment and stabilization, determining which wounds were survivable, applying field dressings, administering morphine in some cases, and directing the wounded toward the next stage of evacuation. The aid post was frequently under shell fire. The medical officer was frequently treating patients while simultaneously managing his own fear and the fear of his orderlies, and doing this without adequate light, in cramped conditions, with limited supplies that were themselves difficult to resupply. Stretcher bearers carried the wounded from the forward positions to the aid post, and from the aid post to the advanced dressing station, which was further back and slightly more sheltered. In the conditions of the Somme and Passchendaele, this journey could take hours. The ground between the front line and the dressing stations was broken by shell craters, often waterlogged, covered in wire and debris, subject to continuing shell fire, and traversed in darkness or in daylight under observation. Stretcher bearers did not stop working when they were exhausted. They did not stop working when the ground conditions made movement nearly impossible. They were required to make multiple trips over the same ground in the same conditions, carrying wounded men on stretchers that were not designed for the terrain, for as long as the wounded kept coming. The casualty clearing station, further back, was the first point in the chain where meaningful surgery could be performed. It was staffed by trained surgeons and nurses and had operating theaters, though these theaters might be tents or requisitioned farm buildings rather than purpose-built medical facilities. The volume of casualties that arrived at a casualty clearing station during a major offensive exceeded its designed capacity by factors that are difficult to describe in neutral terms. Surgeons operated continuously for 20 and 30 hours at a stretch, then rested briefly and operated again. The categories of wound that could be addressed were determined by time constraints as much as by medical judgment. A man with a chest wound requiring complex surgery might receive less surgical attention than a man with a limb wound requiring amputation, not because his wound was less serious, but because the amputation could be completed faster, returning the surgical team to availability for the next patient more quickly. Amputation rates during World War I were high by modern standards. The standard of wound care for infected or extensively damaged limbs was amputation, and the infections that made amputation necessary were common because the soil of the Western Front contained an extraordinary concentration of bacterial contamination from years of intensive use and from the decomposing organic matter present in enormous quantities throughout the front zone. Gas gangrene, caused by Clostridium bacteria that thrived in the anaerobic conditions of deep tissue wounds contaminated with this soil, was a constant threat and produced some of the most severe injuries in the medical record. The 12th reality was the management of the dead. The Western Front produced dead in quantities that no existing administrative or cultural framework was designed to handle. And the institutional response to this problem reveals something important about what the war was and what the governments fighting it understood it to be. In earlier wars, the dead had been managed through a combination of local burial practices, individual and unit-level commemoration, and the gradual acceptance of loss that accompanies armed conflict conducted at a smaller scale and a slower pace. The industrialized dead of World War I did not fit this framework. They arrived in quantities that overwhelmed every available burial resource at unpredictable times and locations in conditions that frequently precluded identification or intact burial. The The standard practice for managing battlefield dead behind the front line was burial in temporary battlefield cemeteries with identity discs or other personal effects used for identification where possible. When a position was overrun or heavily shelled, bodies might be buried in mass graves or by the incidental process of earth being thrown over them by subsequent explosions. Many men were buried and then disinterred by subsequent bombardment, and some were buried and disinterred multiple times. The landscape of the front was, literally, a graveyard in which the boundaries between ground and grave had been dissolved. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission, established during the war as the Graves Registration Commission, developed a systematic approach to the problem that produced the military cemeteries that now cover the landscape of northern France and Belgium. This system was administratively impressive. It was also built on a political decision that had been made early in the war and that was consistently maintained. British dead would not be repatriated. The official rationale was that repatriation was impractical at the volume required and would create inequity between families who could afford private transport and those who could not. The practical effect of this policy was that the British government retained physical control of its military dead, concentrated them in locations that could be administratively managed, and prevented families from experiencing the cost of the war through the private ceremony of individual burial and mourning. Approximately a third of British war dead have no known grave. In many cases, this is because the bodies were not recovered. In some cases, it is because the bodies were recovered but could not be identified, having been too severely damaged by shellfire or decomposition. The Thiepval Memorial to the Missing on the Somme, the largest British war memorial in the world, bears the names of 72,195 officers and men of the British and South African forces who were killed on the Somme between 1915 and 1918, and whose graves are not known. It is not a monument to absence as an accident. It is a monument to the systematic inability of the institutional frameworks of the war to maintain individual identity in the face of industrial killing. The 13th reality was the experience of the home front and the management of information. The governments of the major combatant powers understood from very early in the war that public support was essential, and that public support was contingent on a version of the war that differed materially from the version being experienced in the trenches. Managing this gap was a continuous institutional project throughout the war, and it was conducted with varying degrees of subtlety and varying degrees of success on all sides. In Britain, the Defence of the Realm Act gave the government sweeping powers to censor press reporting, control communications, and prosecute individuals who published material deemed to harm the war effort. These powers were used extensively. Photographs of British dead were suppressed. Casualty figures were released in delayed, aggregated, and in some cases misleading forms that obscured the actual scale of losses. Newspaper correspondents at the front were accredited by the military, which meant their continued access depended on maintaining a working relationship with the authorities whose operations they were reporting on. The result was a press corps that was, with individual exceptions, more a component of the information management system than an independent check on it. Letters sent home by soldiers were subject to censorship by their officers, which meant that the primary channel through which men at the front could communicate the reality of their experience to their families was systematically monitored and selectively suppressed. Men learned to self-censor, not because they were ordered to do so, though they sometimes were, but because they understood that certain content would be removed or would cause their letters to be delayed, and because they did not want to cause unnecessary distress to people who could do nothing about the situation they were describing. The result was a sustained divergence between the public version of the war, in which British soldiers were courageous and cheerful, the cause was just and clearly understood, the officers were competent and humane, and the conditions were demanding but manageable, and the private version, which circulated in letters that passed censorship by speaking in code, in conversations in rest billets, and in the private memories that men carried home with them and rarely found adequate language to express. The 14th reality was the experience of officers and what it revealed about the class system. The British Army of World War I was structured by the class system of the society that produced it in ways that were both obvious and subtle. Officers were drawn predominantly from the public school and university-educated upper and upper-middle classes. Other ranks were drawn predominantly from the working and lower-middle classes. These two groups experienced the same war in conditions that were materially different in ways that were significant and that were understood by everyone involved. Officers had dugouts. Other ranks had dugouts too, but officer dugouts were typically larger, better furnished, and more insulated from the immediate conditions of the trench. Officers had servants, batmen, who managed their personal equipment, prepared their food, and handled domestic tasks. Officers ate better food, prepared more carefully, and ate it at tables rather than from mess tins in the mud. Officers had access to alcohol in a way that other ranks did not. The officers' mess maintained wine and spirits as a matter of course, while other ranks received a daily rum ration that was insufficient for intoxication and served primarily as a physical and psychological fortification before attacks. These material differences were real and significant, but they should not obscure the more fundamental reality, which is that junior officers in the British Army, the lieutenants and second lieutenants who led platoons and companies, had a higher casualty rate than any other rank. They were required to lead from the front. They went over the top first. They were visible to their men and to the enemy. They carried revolvers rather than rifles, which made them identifiable as officers and therefore priority targets for enemy snipers and machine gunners. The average combat life expectancy of a junior British officer on the Western Front in the first years of the war was measured in weeks, and this produced a rate of attrition in the commissioned officer corps that transformed the social composition of the army over the course of the war, as men who would not previously have received commissions were promoted to fill vacancies that could not be filled in any other way. The officer class sent its sons to die in very large numbers. This is a fact that complicates simple class analysis of the war, and it is a fact that the officer class itself was acutely aware of. The public schools that had educated the officer corps, Eton, Harrow, Winchester, Rugby, and hundreds of others, lost former pupils at a rate that struck their communities as catastrophic and that produced a particular form of grief specific to the educated elite. The sense that a generation of exceptional men who had been prepared specifically for leadership, had been expended in a war that their leadership could not have changed. The 15th reality was the racial and colonial dimension of the war. World War I was not fought only by the nations of Western Europe. It was fought on every continent except Antarctica, and it drew manpower from every territory under imperial control by the combatant powers. The British Empire mobilized approximately 2.5 million men from India, approximately 500,000 from Africa, approximately 600,000 from Canada, approximately 330,000 from Australia, approximately 112,000 from New Zealand, and smaller numbers from territories across the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. These men fought in multiple theaters including the Western Front, the Gallipoli Campaign, the campaign in Mesopotamia, the campaign in East Africa, and numerous smaller operations. The experience of non-white soldiers in the imperial armies of World War I was shaped by the same racial hierarchies that structured the societies that produced those armies. Indian soldiers served under British officers and were formally excluded from the commissioned officer ranks until very late in the war, when a small number of Indians were granted the King's Commission. South African soldiers were divided by race. White soldiers served in combat units, while black South Africans were largely restricted to the South African Native Labour Corps, which served on the Western Front in non-combat roles, but was still exposed to the same dangers as combat troops, including the torpedo attack that sank the SS Mendi in 1917, killing 646 black South Africans. African soldiers from French and British colonial territories were used in combat roles with varying degrees of recognition and uniformly with inferior status relative to white soldiers from the metropolitan countries. The French tirailleurs sénégalais, a term applied broadly to black African soldiers regardless of their actual origin, served in large numbers on the Western Front and suffered proportionally severe casualties. The racist pseudoscience of the period had produced a body of military opinion that African soldiers were particularly suited for assault operations because they supposedly lacked the capacity for fear that made European soldiers hesitant. This belief, which was false, was used to justify using African soldiers in attacks that incurred disproportionately high casualties. The contribution of colonial soldiers to the Allied victory was systematically minimized in the post-war commemorative frameworks that shaped how the war was remembered. Indian soldiers who died on the Western Front are commemorated at the Neuve-Chapelle Indian Memorial and at the Menin Gate. But the institutional histories of most British campaigns gave disproportionate credit to British formations and insufficient credit to the Indian, Canadian, Australian, and other imperial troops who fought alongside them, and in many cases carried a larger share of the combat burden. The 16th reality was the prisoner of war system, and what it revealed about how the war was administered. Approximately 8 million men were taken prisoner during World War I. The experience of being a prisoner varied enormously depending on which country held you, which year of the war it was, and what your status was. German prisoners held by Britain and France in Western Europe generally had better survival rates than men held in other theaters, particularly than prisoners held in Turkey or in the more chaotic prisoner exchanges of the Eastern Front. The Geneva Convention of 1906 established minimum standards for prisoner treatment, and these standards were adhered to with varying degrees of consistency. What the prisoner of war system revealed was the administrative persistence of the war machine even when the immediate tactical justification for its operations had been suspended. Men who were captured ceased to be combatants, but continued to be subjects of military bureaucracy, classified, numbered, processed, and managed by systems that treated them as inventory. The labor of prisoners was used extensively by all the major powers. German prisoners worked in British farms and factories, British prisoners worked in German mines and on German roads, and Russian prisoners were used as industrial labor in Germany in conditions of severe deprivation that produced mass mortality from starvation and disease. The use of prisoner labor was not a violation of the contemporary laws of war in most respects. The Geneva Convention permitted the use of prisoner labor for non-military purposes, but the conditions under which this labor was performed were not consistently monitored or enforced, and the deaths that resulted from inadequate food, shelter, or medical care for prisoners were absorbed into the same administrative framework that absorbed all war-produced deaths. They were recorded, categorized, and filed. The 17th reality was the Eastern Front and how it differed from the Western. The Western Front has dominated the historical memory of World War I in the English-speaking world, partly because Britain and the United States fought primarily on the Western Front, and partly because the conditions of the Western Front, the static trench warfare, the massive set-piece battles, lent themselves to the particular kind of industrial-scale futility that became the dominant image of the war in its literary and cultural legacy. But the war on the Eastern Front was in many respects more severe, more mobile, and more lethal. The Eastern Front extended from the Baltic to the Black Sea, a distance of approximately 1,000 miles compared to the 400 miles of the Western Front, and could not be held as a continuous static line by the number of men available. The front moved, sometimes dramatically. The German offensive of 1915 drove Russian forces back hundreds of miles and produced some of the largest military retreats in history. The Russian Brusilov offensive of 1916 was the most successful Allied offensive of the war in terms of territorial gain and German and Austro-Hungarian casualties, and yet it is largely unknown in the English-speaking world because it happened on the wrong front. The armies of the Eastern Front were less well supplied than their Western counterparts, and the casualties were correspondingly larger. Russia alone suffered approximately 9 million military casualties during the war. The Eastern Front also produced conditions that more directly merged military and civilian suffering. The retreating armies of both sides practiced deliberate scorched earth policies, destroying crops, livestock, and infrastructure in areas they were abandoning to deny them to the enemy. Large civilian populations were forcibly displaced. Areas that changed hands multiple times suffered repeated destruction. The organized violence against civilians that would become the defining feature of the Second World War was not yet the explicit policy of most combatant powers in the First World War, but it was present, particularly in the treatment of Jewish populations in Eastern Europe, who were targeted for persecution by multiple armies on multiple sides on the basis of racist suspicion of dual loyalty. The 18th reality was the end of the war, and why it does not function as resolution. The armistice of November 11th, 1918, ended the fighting on the Western Front at 11 o'clock in the morning, and the manner of its timing has been the subject of historical scrutiny that has only intensified with the passage of time. The armistice was signed at 5 o'clock in the morning, effective 6 hours later. During those 6 hours, operations continued. Commanders who had known for hours that the war would end at 11 o'clock ordered attacks, counter-battery fire, reconnaissance missions, and other military actions that produced casualties. The total Allied casualties on November 11, 1918, in the hours between the signing and the effective time of the armistice, were approximately 11,000, a number comparable to the casualties of D-Day in the Second World War. The reasons for continuing military operations in the hours before the armistice took effect have been attributed to various factors. Institutional momentum, the difficulty of communicating orders through the chain of command quickly enough. Individual commanders who did not trust that the armistice would hold and wanted to improve their tactical position, and commanders who simply chose to continue operating because they had the authority to do so and saw no reason not to. The historical record does not support a single explanation. What it supports is the observation that the institutional systems that had been generating casualties for 4 years did not stop generating casualties when the political decision to stop the war was made. They stopped generating casualties when the specified time arrived and a communications protocol was activated that made further operations illegal. The 19th reality was the post-war failure to address the psychological and physical cost of the war. The men who survived the war returned to societies that had, in many cases, been profoundly altered by it. The economies of the major combatant nations had been disrupted. Debts had accumulated to levels that constrained government expenditure for years, and the social structures that had existed before the war had been destabilized by the mobilization and loss of large portions of the adult male population. The men themselves returned in physical and psychological conditions that varied widely, but that in aggregate represented a massive demand on social and medical resources. Disabled veterans, men who had lost limbs, eyes, hearing, or who had suffered lung damage from gas, required ongoing medical care, prosthetics, and in many cases vocational training for occupations they could perform with their injuries. The scale of this need was enormous. Britain alone had approximately 240,000 men who had undergone amputation during the war, and the prosthetics industry, the rehabilitation programs, and the pension system were all inadequate to the demand placed on them. Men with psychological injuries received even less adequate support, primarily because the institutional framework for understanding those injuries was underdeveloped and because the cultural framework that surrounded them was actively hostile. The dominant social narrative of the post-war period required veterans to be either heroic survivors or tragic casualties, and men with shell shock, men who were not physically injured but were unable to function normally, who had nightmares, who could not maintain employment, who drank heavily, who were prone to violent or erratic behavior, fit neither category comfortably. They were experienced by their families as burdens, by their communities as problems, and by the medical and pension systems as administrative challenges that the system's categories were not designed to accommodate. The pension boards that adjudicated claims for war-related disability used standards developed before the war's psychological costs were understood, and they applied those standards conservatively throughout the 20s and 30s, in an environment where government economy was a persistent political pressure. Men with demonstrable physical injuries received pensions that were often insufficient, but at least acknowledged the connection between their service and their condition. Men with psychological conditions faced a much harder path, because the standards of evidence required to demonstrate psychological disability were both higher and less clearly defined, and because the institutional incentive to find against such claims was reinforced by a cultural assumption that psychological breakdown represented individual weakness rather than systemic damage. The 20th reality was this: the war established a template, not a template for how to prevent future conflicts. Not a template for international cooperation, though the League of Nations was built on a version of that aspiration and failed in ways that confirmed the most pessimistic reading of what the war had produced. A template for how industrial societies mobilize their populations, manage the costs of industrial warfare, and administer mass death in forms that can be sustained politically across multiple years. The industrialization of killing that characterized World War I did not represent a deviation from the political and economic systems that produced it. It represented those systems functioning at scale. The armies were organized on industrial principles because the societies that produced them were organized on industrial principles. The bureaucratic management of casualties, the forms, the categories, the administrative language that replaced moral language in the institutional processing of death, was not a corruption of how those societies understood human value. It was an extension of how those societies already understood certain categories of human being, as productive units, as manpower, as assets to be maintained, deployed, and written off according to the requirements of the enterprise they served. The war killed approximately 17 million people and wounded approximately 20 million more. These figures have been repeated in so many contexts that they have lost most of their capacity to produce reaction. They are statistics, and statistics at this scale function differently from the function of the number 1 million applied to money or the number 20 applied to years. They do not produce emotional responses proportional to their magnitude because the human nervous system was not evolved to process numbers of this size as emotionally significant quantities. What did not happen after the war ended is in some ways more significant than what did happen. There were war crimes trials in Leipzig that were widely recognized as inadequate even at the time. There were reparations that served primarily to humiliate Germany without solving any of the underlying economic and political problems that had contributed to the war. There were peace treaties that redrew the map of Europe in ways that created new instabilities without resolving the old ones. There was a decade and a half of international negotiation that produced treaties and protocols and commissions that the next crisis would demonstrate had accomplished nothing structural. The men who had run the war, the generals, the politicians, the industrialists, the administrators, largely remained in their positions or advanced to higher positions. The strategic errors that had produced the catastrophe at the Somme and Verdun and Passchendaele and Gallipoli and Caporetto were subjected to official inquiries that produced official reports that reached official conclusions that were filed in official archives. The careers of the men responsible were, with individual exceptions, not seriously damaged by the scale of the failures they had presided over. The medical records of the war were partially preserved and partially destroyed. The censorship apparatus was dismantled, and some of what it had suppressed gradually became public knowledge over the following decades, as the veterans aged and the institutional incentives to maintain wartime information management weakened. The shell shock files were classified for decades. Some of the records of the executions for cowardice were sealed for 75 years. The cemeteries remained, the names on the walls remained, the missing remained missing. The land itself retained the evidence of the war in ways that continue to surface. Every year, the soil of northern France and Belgium returns shells, grenades, wire equipment, and human remains that had been buried under or incorporated into the ground, and that agricultural activity or erosion or construction brings back to the surface. These are called in French the iron harvest, the récolte de fer. and they are processed by specialist companies that collect and dispose of unexploded ordnance in a continuous operation that has been running since the war ended and that will continue for the foreseeable future because the amount of unexploded material in the ground is so large that current rates of recovery suggest it will not be fully cleared for decades if it can be fully cleared at all. Some estimates suggest the ground of the former Western Front contains hundreds of millions of unfired or misfired shells, a portion of which remain capable of detonating. More than a century after the war that placed them there was officially declared to be over.